Over the last 3 years, we have built the biggest wargaming board in YouTube history, a massive megastructure that spans the war-torn streets of OSGILIATH, across the Pelennor, to the white walls and bastions of Minas Tirith. Today, in one of the most requested videos in my comment section, we look back on the entire build journey in what is easily the most important project in the history of this channel. Welcome to the Supercut of OSGILIATH.
The city of OSGILIATH has been reclaimed for Gondor!
OSGILIATH is an incredibly special project for Zorpazorp because it is the whole reason we are here. This whole channel began with OSGILIATH, and its legacy has endured through my time here on YouTube. And last November, 2 of the most recent videos on the project were my first ever videos to hit 500,000 views. But we're going to start by winding back the clock to the video that began it all. And it is a very different type of video and a much younger Lockie.
I've been working on this video really for about 7.5 years, which is a pretty long time.
This video came out all the way back on the 29th of October of 2017, and I made this video basically as a little throwaway project for some old friends on an old Warhammer forum, 40k online. It surprised me, grinding up to about 10,000 views, and I was contacted by a whole bunch of folks who played Middle-earth SBG, and through this video I connected with a vibrant global gaming scene that I didn't even know existed. I got inspired by other people's wonderful projects, and I made a few more scenic builds, and then when the new edition for the game launched in August of 2018, the video exploded, flying from 10k to 100k in just a week. Over the course of this video, I showed off the original modular tile structure, waffled on about the campaign system we'd built, and basically showed off everything that I had built over a 7-year hobby project, before finally showing some actual crafting with some very dodgy time lapses of what I thought at the time was going to be the final building on this gaming board. Oh my, little did I know, 5 years later, I would still be working on this beast. I made a second video 6 months later showing off how the pieces came together in greater detail and having a bit of a better look at the layout as it stood, but this is basically how it stayed for quite some time. It was featured in a few different battle reports, but strangely we never did a massive battle report on the full layout, and to be honest I don't really know why.
The final piece of OSGILIATH is finished, and I think it's come together pretty well. Final piece of OSGILIATH.
But as Zorpazorp grew, I grew as a scenery crafter, and I became less and less happy with my beloved OSGILIATH until the time finally came to begin a solemn undertaking. But first, a word from today's sponsor. You know what I love most about MMOs? It's the thrill of battling through dungeons and bosses with different parties. You get to assemble your squad and take down big baddies together. It's freaking awesome. And the best part, tomorrow you can switch up your party and have a totally different battle experience. Plus, you can score some seriously sick loot from those bosses too. That's what I'm talking about, folks. But you know what's even cooler? I found Hero Wars, where you don't just control one character, you get to build and command your own epic parties to storm through dungeons and crush the competition. Trust me, Hero Wars is the real deal. It's the ultimate adventure, and you're gonna love it. Hero Wars offers a wide range of heroes to choose from, each with their own unique abilities and playstyles. The battles are intense and require strategic thinking to come out on top, which keeps players on their toes. In addition, the game has a strong social component, allowing players to team up with others and compete against each other in various modes. The developers are also constantly updating the game with new content, keeping things fresh and exciting for players. Overall, Hero Wars is a fun and addictive game that has something for everyone. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Here's a question for you. Where can you get 30,000 coins, 600 emeralds, and 5 awesome heroes to start dominating in Hero Wars right away? Too slow. The answer is in the link in the description below. Play Hero Wars now. Today, we're returning to the roots of Zorpazorp and smashing them to pieces. OSGILIATH, the project that started it all. This monstrosity is over 100 square feet of modular hobby madness, cobbled together by a previous Lockie fumbling his way through the dark and pushing his hobby skills to the limit. It's a project that's incredibly dear to me, and it's so large that I can't even fit it in my studio, so here we are in the backyard to see its last moments of glory. Today is bittersweet, because today we say goodbye. As much as I love this piece, I can no longer see past its imperfections. The quality of the stonework carving is subpar, the contrast between the bricks and the awful ground sculpting is sickening, the aerated white foam shows through the surface texture, and the horrible grid pattern of the modular tiles is totally immersion breaking. The river is an absolute embarrassment. At the time I nearly dissolved half the board using the wrong type of resin, but more than anything, what could be an awesome piece is marred constantly by some very amateur techniques.
But that's not to say that there's nothing here worth saving. These buildings are really interesting, and even though they're not as well carved as if I'd done them more recently, they do have a nice unifying aesthetic that we can build on and enhance.
Aesthetics aside, there's also a whole host of gameplay problems with the original design. The slope of the bridges isn't gaming friendly, and the islands are full of choke points that make gaming a huge grind.
So it's time for a redesign of this relic of Zorpazorp history. But first we have to sort out what parts are useful and what are not.
Up first on the chopping block is the eastern riverbank, and we'll be starting with all the small buildings on single 1x1 tiles. Our main goal here is to unceremoniously rip them from their baseboard mounting whilst preserving the stonework above, so we'll be using some delicate precision tools. These pieces range in quality and were constructed somewhere between year 5 and 7 of the build and feature a lot of different levels of detail. As I examine these, I'm actually pretty impressed with a lot of the carving. They are going to need a great deal of sprucing up. A few extra foam details here and there, and they should come up great. The foam ground layer underneath is totally expendable, so by going hard into that, we can easily protect the precious foam board above. Up next on this side of the riverbank are the larger buildings. The biggest of these, the weapons factory, is conveniently unmounted. This piece was actually the last component built, featured heavily in the very first video on this channel. Well, not the very first, but those truly dark secrets aren't yet ready for the light of day.
Greetings, guys.
During construction, I was already pretty unhappy with the basing system, so I never mounted it. I guess I knew deep down that eventually this day would come. The cathedral, however, is firmly mounted to the base with heavy pillars and gentle archways needing a genuinely deft hand to preserve. There is one last larger building mounted onto a large foam board piece that also contains a bridge who we won't be touching just yet, so he gets pulled off too, and already our collection of buildings freed from the shackles of their unimpressive landscapes is growing. The final buildings of the Whitestone series are the riverbank pieces. Unfortunately, we are never going to be able to salvage the portions of these buildings that are submerged within resin. We simply have to slice through the structure itself and either rebuild those mountings or have them sunk even deeper when we reuse them. I'm also super excited to announce that I'm releasing my very first STL, because if you've got a flooded city, you've just got to have some orc assault rafts. Create your ultimate Normandy OSGILIATH fantasies right now at Zorpazorp.com. We'll be looking at these guys in depth in a future video, but I thought I'd throw them up now so that you guys can get them printing. Link down in the description. Now, I'm sure you've all noticed that this board features stonework of 2 different shades. These disparate paint jobs mark the largest period of rest in this project, where I stopped working on it for over a year and then changed my mind about the paint job. Just another perk of this redesign is that the entire city is getting repainted from scratch, so we will finally have a cohesive color palette. The bridges themselves are standalone, but the 2 ramps are mounted on baseboard, so with some deft knife work, these joined the pile of salvage. But here we face the biggest decision yet. Ripping the other buildings off the boards was easy, but what do we do about these massive islands? I definitely still want them to have some height, but the huge, barely carved chunks of foam look awful, so I returned to our source material and had a closer look at the mid-river sections. They actually don't feature a lot of cliff work at all. There is carved stonework all the way down to the water's edge, so here began the biggest undertaking of the salvage operation. Small island first, hack, smash, crunch, rip, boom, done. I actually think I'm going to remove this island altogether and mount this gatehouse structure to one of the bridges on the riverbank, as it basically
never saw any gameplay isolated out in the river. Continuing our reverse chronology of buildings, it's time for this little mini castle known as OSGILIATH, the palatial court of Gondor. Again, this piece has great potential, but the best part of it, the crumbling hall, never saw any gameplay, and the fortress is a huge creator of problematic choke points. So I'm thinking I'll completely repurpose this too and move it over to the riverbank to become a large flooded dockyard. Lastly, and absolutely not least, the largest, most complex and oldest structure of the whole board, and ironically still my favorite building, the Dome of Stars. This building houses the Palantir, the great seeing stone of Gondor, and is easily the most iconic landmark of the city, but it is super affixed into the landscape. The main dome was well mounted, taking a lot of soaring, and trying to cut all the little pillars under the courtyard walls was a delicate operation. So, after much cursing and being yelled at by Larissa for cursing within earshot of our children, the entire city has been freed from its polystyrene shackles. And now the fun truly begins. I took all of the pieces into the studio and started having some real fun exploring layouts. The redesign is definitely going to have a lot less modularity on the riverbank side, so exploring these building options and how they interact is key. To achieve the desired density and scope on the riverbank, I ended up deciding that the only pieces that would be used on the island was the dome itself and actually the massive weapons factory. This piece is going to look really cool going right down into the level of the water. That frees up a lot of the island components to come back over to the banks, and when combined with a whole bunch of rubble left over from the Minas Tirith stairwell build, we've got the bones for a really cool urban layout. This ruined city of Gondor captured my heart in 2002 and was the first location to ever inspire me to make Wargaming Terrain. I've been building OSGILIATH scenery for over 17 years, and this very board is the culmination of all of that work, including a huge selection of ruined structures that we brutally harvested last month from my previous attempt, which spanned much of the last decade. But today, we begin with a clean slate, and up first, as always, is a trip to the lumberyard. And with our choice of cuts, we can truly change the shape of our project before it has even begun. Now, I decided for this build that I would focus just on the western riverbank to start with, so I built a rough floor plan that created a network of large tiles spanning a total dimension of 5 feet deep by 16 feet long. The main layout is 3 4x5 city blocks divided by 2 2x5 sections for the landings of the bridges. The entire riverbank is then split long ways, with the panels closer to the water having the extra foot of width to allow for a good portion of the river to be featured on the board. With lots of panels the same dimensions, if we build the landforms cleverly, we'll be able to create a lot of varied layouts as a single riverbank, and even an option to join the bridges together to fight across the full river bank to bank. I grabbed the first 2 panels to form our first city block, which will be made up of exclusively the old salvage buildings. Let's call it Old Town. Old Town is going to be the perfect starting point to establish our approach to this project, because this city presents some very unique challenges. The biggest is that OSGILIATH is flooded, and not just because the water is rising, the foundations of the city itself have been slowly sinking into the river for nearly 1,000 years, and I plan on incorporating that sinking flooded aspect heavily into the board's design. We're going to need parts of the city at different heights, some above the waterline, some below, as well as a general sloping feeling towards the river's edge. For this first city block, I decided to begin with the back 2x4 portion, which would be nice and flat, so I threw down a sheet of extruded polystyrene foam with some foam-safe construction adhesive. Without the varying landform in this section to create interest, it's all going to come down to the layout of the city streets themselves. On the riverbank piece, I opted for a mix of verticality options. Starting off at the height of the backboard, I had the central section slope naturally down towards the water's edge, whilst keeping the sides as higher platforms so that these could join nicely with future pieces. I then opted for 2 specific buildings to be partially submerged in the river, one sinking from the upper platform and the second sitting on a tilted stone foundation that has partially collapsed. I spent several hours optimizing the perfect configuration, making sure there was a nice dense feeling to the ruins with some great mini environments within the larger cityscape, as well as enabling the board to tessellate with future pieces by always keeping those edges at 2 inches high. With the layout locked down and marked up, it was time to try a brand new method of ground texture. I really wanted to capture the perfect flag and cobblestone aesthetic and ensure the level of detail was consistent throughout the whole build, with as much attention being paid to the flooring as the crumbling ruins. I borrowed a whole bunch of awesome textured rollers from my mate Dan and grabbed my absolute favourite hobby material ever, a Geek Gaming Scenics modelling compound. Now, full disclosure, this was a bit of an experiment. Modelling compound is a plaster cellulose fibre blend that is mixed with water and sets rock hard, but it's designed as a landform sculpting tool, which will then have layers of glues and flocks and ground covers poured over the top. It's not meant to be a finishing layer, so it might not be the most durable gaming surface, but I'm hoping I can lock that down with varnishes later on, and to be honest, look, it's a ruined city, who cares? As I was combining several small ruins into one large crumbling structure in the center of this city block, I decided to mount them on a stone plinth, so I cut a sheet of foam board to size and then started smashing down some modeling compound and got rolling. Because of the awesome drying time, I had to work in small sections at a time, and the key here is to get the compound as level as possible to ensure that the roller imprints texture on all of the surface. I eventually started using a rolling pin to help smooth it out on the plate. I had great fun applying different textures in different streets, flagstones here, cobble here, brickwork there, to create a quite realistic look for the Warren of Osgiliath. And at any time, if there was a bad imprint or an imperfection, who cares? It's a ruined city and I can just dump some base ready rubble on it down the track anyway. So that technique has worked amazingly. The texture of the brickwork across all of the different streets from the different rollers looks fantastic, and of course this is Osgiliath, the Stalingrad of Lord of the Rings, so all my mistakes and dodgy joins, why, they're just happy little accidents. With the roads down on Upper Old Town, I glued down all the buildings, put some foam bricks around as a gutter trim for my new large structure, and then applied a whole bunch more modelling compound around the place to begin creating the rubble profile throughout the city. After this has all been painted, I'll be dumping a whole heap of base ready on the board to fill out all the debris, so this is just a starting point, but the rock hard modelling compound also really helps lock down the buildings and give their mounting points some strength. With Upper Old Town looking awesome, it was time to get onto the docks, and applying the ground texture here was much trickier because of the undulating landscape. But with my thinking cap on, I glued down all of the sheets that would need texture whilst keeping the plinths and the upper elements removable, so I could use them to help me line up my compound and then lift them out of the way to allow the texture rollers to gain access. For the central section where the ground is a big meeting points of roads from different directions, I chose the cobblestone roller as there is no square repeatable pattern to try and preserve, and it absolutely worked fantastically. I used some foam safe adhesive to glue down all the buildings and final plinths, and now it's time to really emphasize the varying verticality with some epic stone retaining walls using a material and technique that is all brand new to me and that I'm shamelessly stealing from Neil over at Real Terrain Hobbies. He created some wonderful stone retaining walls with epoxy cast, a 2-part sculpting putty that hardens to rigid plastic in 24 hours and takes amazing detail. And it is perfect here as it's really sticky and it will bond brilliantly as an upright wall. So I grabbed some foam core board and cut to size all of my retaining walls and then started mixing and rolling out some putty. First with the rolling pin and then my textured rollers. Technically, these stonework patterns I've got on the rollers were designed for flooring, but it totally sells as vertical wall stonework. To make sure the tools don't stick to the putty, I used the Sansador solvent and finished off the textured surface of the roller with some crumpled up alfoil. This process worked like an absolute dream and the finish is insanely high detail. If I had $2,000 to spend on putty, I would just use this for the whole board. It would just be such an incredibly durable gaming surface, but it is a very expensive material. I tack joined the walls in place with hot glue and some PVA and joined any edges between those retaining retaining walls by simply adding in some more epoxy cast, blending it, and sculpting back the brick detail. To finish off those walls, I sculpted some thicker flagstones to go across the top, using a mix of more epoxy cast on some and then just some foam bricks, as well as adding in a few stairwells using the techniques from our first installment. And just as before, I began to establish the rubble by slapping down modeling compound all over the place, and then it was time to bring the boards together. And what a layout we have. I cannot wait to get this guy painted, rubbled, flooded with resin, and then start rolling some dice. I'm really happy with the layout of this little city block, and I think it's been a good test case for ways to really create some interest. We've established really fantastic verticality with the upper stories of the buildings, the sloping landscape, and the different terraces of battle. There's a good mix of open and restricted line of sight, and I can see lots of little worlds within the whole board where little mini battles within the broader conflict will unfold. As we get more of these blocks completed, we'll be able to fully explore the modularity potential of the design, and when she's added to her friends, my goodness, what a board this will be. I love the layout of the streets, and now we get to finally take it to the next level and get this partially flooded city ready for gaming. Unfortunately, our first task is to build a structural frame of timber to mount the board to. Sadly, the masonite has been sitting in my storage unit for over a year and has completely warped in places. So a timber brace screwed together and then mounted with a few fixings where possible, and liquid nails is the way to go. This is actually an essential component anyway when making a huge resin water feature, as the baseboard must have a really high structural integrity to resist warping as the resin cures, and it also helps to have good surfaces for mounting edging to stop the resin from leaking. So I totally should have done this from the start anyway. But now it's painting time. Yes, painting before rubble, and you'll see why a bit later on. Now, I originally intended to go absolutely hardcore on this paint job, bust out my airbrush and pick out every single one of the bricks like I used to do on the early Minas Tirith pieces to give them a subtly different toning, but the more I poured over the reference material, it's just not accurate. The city is just a massive slab of grey. So how do we paint that but still keep it interesting? Instead of varying the undertones, we're going to be varying the overtones. So the primary color blocking is just a whole bunch of spray cans. Up first is an all-over coating on the entire board, both buildings and road, with Rust-Oleum dark grey. This is completely even coverage. At first I was a bit scared losing all the detail of the old paint scheme, but I'm rolling the dice here and saying goodbye, and it totally paid dividends. Now we're gonna do two zenithal passes, first with a light grey and then with a white over that dark grey. These passes are sprayed onto the buildings from directly above to create lighter tones on all of the parts of the buildings that would be exposed to a top light like the sun, and create shadows in all of those hidden recesses. The light grey I applied quite heavily so that it kind of became the primary toning of the buildings, and that dark grey underlayer is really quite minimal just in those recesses, and then the white layer was used very sparingly just to really accent highlights on those bright details. Top down, however, does not work on the roadways. Just do that on the buildings, otherwise you get a really flat, shapeless color on all of the flagstones. So instead, spray the highlights parallel to the road surface to hit the tops of all of the flagstones, and that leaves the grooves with the darker layers beneath. I ended up doing mostly grey highlights on the flagstones and very little with the white, which also helped create a kind of subtle toning difference between the roads and the buildings. Then, before the rattle cans go away, I created a foundational gradient for the river by putting down a layer of black and then adding in passes of dark grey and light grey working towards the riverbank. Essentially, to simulate depth, we want lighter colours near the shallow parts and darker parts at those depths. We'll do more to this in a moment with the airbrush, and then this will really come to life. We've got a nice color profile, but up next we need a big, sexy black wash, so I followed Jez's recipe from Black Magic Craft, and that's Jez's as in Jez, short for Jeremy, not Jazza. My broad Australian accent and propensity to nickname all my mates always creates a few conniptions in the comments section whenever I mention Jeremy. This was slapped down all over the board, which created some nice toning and brought down the highlights a little, but it was too uniform, and so it was time to break out the big guns. Yes, it's time for oils. Now, I cannot honestly believe how long it took me to get into using oils and enamels and stuff that is just not acrylic paints. I get the fear factor, guys, but if you think Nuln oil is talent in a bottle, oils and enamels will blow your minds. I first mixed up a black wash by thinning some Winsor & Newton lamp black with some foam safe thinner, and then applied that heavily all over the board. Some sections it was an all over wash, just like the acrylic black, especially in regions where I needed more definition like the retaining walls, but on the buildings I stippled it and dumped it on unevenly, let it run, creating stains and super patchy coverage that looks like grime and faded paintwork. I cannot stress enough how easy this was. It's a total walk in the park, mate. And already the buildings are getting so much character. And now we get to bring in the pièce de résistance. I mixed up a little brown wash, a little bit of 50-50 burnt sienna and burnt umber, and then applied that all over the place in a really thin pass to create layers and layers of grime and dirt. You can really go to town with this and have so much fun all around the bases of the buildings, staining the sides of the walls, streaks of dirty rainwater or refuse splotched into recesses where water would pool or dust would build up. A big shout out to my boy Eric from Eric's Hobby Workshop for teaching me this gem in the latest Tubatown Minas Tirith collab. So much fun and it looks so good. But up next, it's airbrush time, and the lads from Scale Modelers Supply here in Australia recently sent me up the Dragonair airbrush with a bunch of swag, and I have been loving it so far. I'm stoked to have an Aussie airbrush company here with such good gear. After a massive deep clean because past Lockie left the airbrush completely clogged with acrylic black lacquer, seriously, fuck that guy, it was time to start laying down our river tones. Now, the Anduin River in the films was shot on a bunch of locations which I have of course kayaked, rafted and personally swum in, yes, even the freezing glacial melts of the Karawau, and as a result of those shooting locations influencing the color grade of the water in both the miniature plates and the wet set at Stone Street Studios where much of OSGILIATH was filmed, the river has quite a blue-grey color palette. So first up, two blues from Vallejo Air, blue and blue-grey. I started applying thin passes over the black to grey gradient. Our aim was to keep that rough change in brightness and simply tone it blue. I quickly abandoned the Vallejo Air blue. It was too concentrated and bright and colorful. I needed that more muted color, so I blended in some grey and then eventually just went with blue-grey completely, and I really fell in love with the color that it created. And it was just so much fun, like applying different concentrations and really enhancing the dappled effect of a really variable depth for the river. Really enjoyable, and once you get airbrushes clean, they are so much fun to use. So we've got a pretty sweet set of tonalities, a nice grey blue for the river, some sweet greys and browns for our filthy stonework, but something is missing. Yes, it's time to make this board absolutely come to life with a whole load of rubble. We'll be using the Geek Gaming Scenics Base Ready range, of course, as always, which is available from my shop, Zorpazorp.com, link down in the description. And first we're going to mix up a nice little blend of grimdark city rubble and coarse rubble or plain city rubble to get a really nice neutral grey that matches our stonework color, and then we are going to bloody dump it everywhere. First we need to grab some fast drying basing glue and slather that all over the board, then ideally let that dry for about 15 minutes till the edges go glossy and tacky, and then we just pile on our rubble. You want to put down the big aggregate sizes first and then a smaller grain size. This will allow the rubble to get a good purchase on all of that foundation. I did this all over the board, up against the walls, all around the river collapsing sections that were heavily damaged, especially where I wanted to cover joins on the tilting tiles to hide the lack of floor cracks that I never sculpted. As I blended the various mixes, I ended up getting a few regions where I had more or less grimdark city rubble, which darkens or lightens the color, and that worked really well to give some sections a little bit of a scorched ground type of feeling. Once you're happy with all of that, give it an hour or so to really grab, and then it's time to start sealing it. Now, for a rubble density which is this intense, there is a pretty serious process to get a long-lasting and durable game board. First, we want to spray or pipette a bunch of isopropyl alcohol and then absolutely soak it in Geek Gaming Matte Scenic Sealant. Do this section by section so that the alcohol hasn't evaporated before the sealant goes down. The ISO is absolutely crucial as it creates a capillary action that carries the sealant molecules deep down into the aggregate blend by breaking the surface tension and allowing it to penetrate deep into the rubble. Then give that board about 12 hours to dry and then do it again. and again and again. Seriously, 3 or 4 big soakings is perfect for a massive amount of super dense rubble, and then you will have a bloody rock solid gaming surface that looks amazing and will survive your gameplay. Now this board isn't done, and we've got some epic stages left. There's some detail missing, some city life, barrels, crates, supplies, damaged furniture, and then of course there's an absolutely massive resin pour. This entire lower portion of the city is going to be ankle deep in water, which means the deepest part will be about an inch in draft.
Games Workshop have just announced they are not only relaunching the system with a brand new OSGILIATH themed starter box and a bunch of OSGILIATH themed battle forces, but also some exciting new plastic, highly modular OSGILIATH ruins. This has absolutely pumped me full of motivation to smash back in and finish off the first half of the board so that we're ready to add the new scenery when it arrives down the track. Both the OSGILIATH starter set and the 4 new battle forces are all on pre-order right now, and if you guys use the affiliate links down in the description, you'll get amazing prices on all your Warhammer goodies, and it will send some dollary dues back to support the channel, so please use those affiliates. It really helps so much. My style of YouTube content is very expensive, as it's very materials and labor intensive, so the extra support from you guys via the affiliates has been super helpful, so thank you so much to everyone who's been using them, as it's genuinely super meaningful to me and my family. Now in our last update, we fully finished our first city block, which you guys will remember is comprised of 2 halves, a 2x4 foot back piece and a 2x3 foot riverbank piece, and we've got the same layout again for this second city block. Eventually all of the river pieces, the 2x3s, are going to have a massive resin pour for that lovely flooded street aesthetic, so I've built the board onto a proper foundation mounting masonite sheeting onto a pine frame. This will give it extra strength to prevent the warping as the resin cures, and also allow me to mount some really serious ceiling panels to the timber below to stop the resin from spilling. Well, hopefully anyway, but we're not up to that yet. First up, I glued down the panels with liquid nails and then started grabbing the last of my ruined buildings from the original OSGILIATH board and started playing around with a bit of a layout idea. The last board, I used a whole bunch of the smaller structures to make a nice claustrophobic warren of streets and alleyways, but that means that all the pieces I'm left with for this build are the larger structures, primarily the dome of the Citadel of Stars and the Hall of OSGILIATH, as well as a heap of fortifications from the 2 central islands of the original build. In a pretty spooky coincidence, I actually began working on this new board 10 years to the day exactly since I finished building the very first island for the first megaboard. Crazy. I wanted to use up everything I could, as this will be our last board using the scratch build components, and then the next 2 boards will feature the Games Workshop plastic ruins. So I cut down the old island gatehouse, which used to be a part of one of the bridges, and I thought about maybe having this as like a bridge or maybe some sort of bastion, and then being relatively happy with my initial ideas, it was time to start building up the foundation. On the backboard, I just threw down a consistent layer of 30mm XPS foam, just low quality structural stuff, as none of this is going to be carved, and then on the larger panel I did the same up to the 18-inch mark, that's halfway up, to line up with the riverbank edge on the first board. This is going to be consistent across all the boards to make sure that all the riverbanks can tessellate. Sadly, the sheets I use for this are just smaller than 4x2 feet, so there's always a little bit of trim to neaten up, but liquid nails and a bit more foam and then some heavy books to weight it all down sorts us out nicely. With the foam foundation down, I could sit the old guardhouse directly into the water and assess the elevation better, and then I locked down the final layout of the build so far. So this is one of the most anxiety-inducing parts of the build process, and it's full of procrastination. But once it starts to come together, the completionist feeling is pretty strong, and I'm getting a bit hyped now. This is the layout I think I have locked. I've basically tried to use every single piece of scratch-built scenery from the original board that we have left, except for those bridge pieces. I've got the old Citadel of Stars. This has been completely reconfigured and joined to OSGILIATH to make this interesting little keep here, sort of like a military structure. Maybe this is a training barracks. Then over here we've got the old weapons factory, and you can see that's really complete, right? It used to have that big ruined top we used on the last board, and that was the part of it that brought ruined kind of elements to it. So we're gonna have to smash that up, and that's kind of really indicative of this whole build. There's a lot of these pieces that are just too intact. They're not ruined enough.
So we'll have a whole rubble phase where we smash a lot of this up once we've got it down. But those have combined together nicely to make that kind of inner landscape. And then over here, what are we doing with the water? So we've got this bridge island piece from one of the bridges of the last mega board, but I don't want to have a bridge on this board. So that is actually going to become a dock. And then that kind of inspired me to start thinking what I could do with this cathedral, and this is going to become a dock as well. So this is just going to have some extra foundations added, and ships can sail right inside, and then we've got a really nice little dock piece there. And so that's kind of really brought the whole theme of the board together as I've been doing this layout. It's going to be some sort of either commerce or perhaps a military driven dockside. This could be some sort of fortification. Maybe this is a barracks. The old Citadel of Stars can be something to do with loading arms and troops onto fleets of Gondor as they sail down the Anduin. And I also really want to have a whole lot of this area quite flooded. So this is going to have a little bit of retaining wall matching up with the other board edge, and then I think all of that is going to be sloping in and rubbled. Stairs down from here that will then go straight down into water that's really seeped up, because we need to have those flooded aspects in every single board. There's good playability, there's a couple of choke points, but I think it's going to work pretty well, especially once we start smashing stuff up a bit more. So now what I'm going to do is grab some permanent marker, mark it all up, get those positions locked in place, and then we start working on the foundation and we can start building these buildings into the board.
With the layout down, I grabbed my Sharpie and marked up the foam foundation with an outline of all the structures, and then it was time to bring the streets to life with a layer of modeling compound and textured rollers. I've used this technique a whole bunch now on the channel, but it was on the last OSGILIATH board where I first tried it, and since I've gotten a lot better at applying it. The key is to work in small sections and roll your texture at just the right level of moisture in the compound mix, as well as the right level of moisture on your roller. You got to keep it really clean too, and that will avoid the compound layer, which is quite thin, from tearing and peeling up, and then you get some amazing textured results. I used 2 rollers on this back section, the kind of generic cobblestone pattern, and then the large flagstones around the thinner streets of the weapons factory, and essentially almost covered the whole 2x4 board. It was quite a bit of compound. Then it was time to jump onto the riverbank board, but first I needed to do some prep on the riverbank itself. I decided I wanted to extend the central dock area to create a little bit more playable area on this side of the keep, so I added in some more foam foundation, which inspired me to add another gate between the 2 docks, which improved the flow of movement around the board substantially. Then, to capture the sinking city feeling and allow some great landing sites for orc rafts making their assault from the other riverbank, I marked up and cut away some flooded sections where the embankment holding up the riverbank has sunk and subsequently been inundated and washed down the Anduin. With this now prepared, I jumped back on the texture roller modeling compound train and threw down some more cobblestones to match the pattern of the inner keep courtyard, and then flagstones for the dockside area that is collapsing into the Anduin. At this point, I'd almost used 3 full bags of modeling compound, and as my warehouse for Zorpazorp.com, my own store where you can buy all of your scenery and hobby needs, is no longer in my living room, I don't have an infinite supply of materials at my fingertips, so I was trying to keep the next couple of layers as thin as possible and get as maximum coverage, and I almost got the whole board covered, but for the time being, that will do for now, and now it's time to mount the structures to the board. At first I tried using hot glue, but because the compound is still quite damp, it often takes like 24 to 48 hours to fully cook off and harden. The structure's just peeled straight off. I really should have let it dry, but I don't have that kind of time right now, so I grabbed some liquid nails and I'll strengthen that bond a little bit further down with some PVA and trimming, but the liquid nails all over the base and then plonking those down and getting nice contact joins between all of the pieces as well. Now, one of the big things I've learned since I did the first city block of this new board is that you can't have modeling compound going all the way up to the edge of a board. It needs to be encased in a foam trim, because when this layer of compound is rolled out so thin to work for this textured technique and it doesn't get supported by another material, it can chip up and peel at the edges. So I cut back the edge of every piece of exposed compound on the edge of the gaming board while it was still damp so that it's nice and easy to cut, and then I grabbed my hot wire cutter and cut down a whole bunch of foam stripping. Larissa and I then threw this down all around the edging, and also we put a trim down around every single
single structure. This is really awesome. I think it looks it adds a little bit of something and helps blend those structures into the board. They look a lot less just plonked on the top, but also this is how we get that extra bit of strength. We threw this all down with a big seam of PVA glue, and that locks all the buildings in hard, and then we're going to leave that all overnight to dry so that is fully locked in place before we come and carve the foam. Once dry, I grabbed my scalpel and slowly carved in a nice brickwork pattern along all the edges around the board edge and the buildings, and then widened those grout lines with a pencil and smashed them with some scrunched up alfoil to impart a nice bit of texture and to soften all the hard edges. And it is absolutely mental how much that little detail of skirting has added to the board. The buildings already feel way less just tacked onto the surface and really start to feel like they belong in the landscape as genuinely constructed buildings. I slid the two boards together and you can see how nicely the board join looks now. I was never going to be able to hide that. It's always going to be obvious that these are two boards, but now at least it looks like an intentional seam of brickwork running through the courtyard rather than an obvious mismatched section of patterning. Then it was time to add yet more detailing to our riverbank pieces by constructing a whole bunch of foam stonework retaining walls, which I carved and textured using the same tried and true Zorpazorp stone method as the trim tiles, starting with simple walls along the riverbank. I then threw down the large dock structure and glued down some more retaining walls on the other side around the collapsing embankment next to the new gate, and then it's time for my absolutely favorite part of this build, the U-boat inspired dock foundation. I carved up a bunch of foam plinths and a stairwell and glued them down to the board under the footprint of the cathedral, and we've got some lovely stairs down to the waterside to a now submerged riverside dock. I'll be adding some more details to this again next week to really take advantage of the mega resin pour we'll be attempting, but for now she's looking fantastic. Well, this board is really coming together, and I'm so happy I've finally managed to make use of all these classic pieces from the first OSGILIATH board and feature them in a format that's actually playable and gaming friendly while still super themed to the flooded city. We've got the foundation of an absolutely massive flooded castle and a mega ruined city. For both the first and second city block, we've been reusing my old OSGILIATH ruins, but today we'll finally be adding some new pieces as we take the first 40 square feet of flooded city to completion. Our first task is to finish the dock sinking into the river. We've already established the flooding riverside in our last build, but integrating this old bridge gatehouse into the landscape is going to create some great visual interest, as well as some really accessible landing spots for orc rafts making their amphibious assaults. I cut about 2 inches off the bottom of the structure to lower it to the ground level of the rest of the city, but soon realized I'd mismeasured and sliced off way too much, but decided to be inspired by my foolishness and carve a new foam XPS plinth to better integrate the old building into the cityscape. I grabbed a bunch of XPS foam, cut it down into strips and mocked up the foundation, allowing it to terrace outwards a little, and then salvaged an old damaged stairwell to make an extra dock lowering down into the waters of the Anduin. Then using a scalpel, ruler, pencil and scrunched up alfoil, I imparted our usual stonework textures all around the outward facing sides of the foundation. I glued them down to the masonite baseboard with liquid nails, checking regularly that they would line up with the dock above, and then sealed the inside of the structure to make sure it was totally watertight, as the other massive advantage of this dock is it will drastically reduce the surface area of the water on this board, which will save a whole heap of epoxy resin when we get to doing our water effects. I glued the dock down on top, making sure it was sitting flush, and then it was time to finish some of the key tower details, namely the towers that have since been broken in the many times the old board had been played with in the last 10 years. These towers are carved from foam coreboard and held up by wooden dowel pillars, very old school techniques indeed, and I thought for about a second I should pin them, but I just could not be arsed with it, so I went to my new favorite method, 5-minute epoxy, to lock them down tight. On the southern tower, I put just a small ruined section and then decided to have the whole top, which was already partially collapsed, smashed off and landed down on the city floor below. The insides of the old gatehouse towers used to have removable side panels to access some horrible balsa wood ramps, so I did away with all of those and decided instead to have the little open side as docks by carving a series of stone plinths, stairs and platforming. For the very lowest level, I carved some flagstones onto a block of foam and then sliced off the texture to make some very thin tiles which will end up submerged down at the base of the tower once the resin has flooded in. And that's going to be a really interesting set of dock structures. After making some trim to neaten the edges of those open faces and building the second dock around in the other tower, the whole dock surface is now finished, and it's really added so much interest to the board, both visually and from a gameplay perspective. Next up, we need to finish the other U-boat inspired dock inside the old cathedral. I made some more of the thin flagstones and placed them around the edges of the dock space so that they could be submerged, just like the last dock, really weathering them and placing a few at different angles as if they're listing or tipping as the whole structure sinks into the river. Then with some more liquid nails, I attached the cathedral and glued that down in place. I originally wanted to continue the stairwell that goes down from the bell tower to that lower dock level, but it didn't really work with how I'd spaced out the tiles, so I decided to cut a hole in the side and put on a little resin cast door, and now that massive bell tower is accessible from the side of the building, which is actually much better for gameplay anyway. Next, we smashed out a big live stream right here on the main channel as part of our OSGILIATH themed streaming arc, and the viewers and I dove into my box of old salvaged rubble from the old build and glued down a heap of pieces all over the board, beginning to build up that rubble profile. These pieces are all part of the old previous board, so they match the stonework of the buildings we've used, and this is the perfect first stage to really build that ruined, war-torn, urban city fight aesthetic. We'll add more rubble very soon, but these pieces help immensely to blend the buildings with the landscape. I then took all the boards outside and did one final pass of weathering, carving and chipping away many of the sections of the older buildings which were just way too intact, and then I grabbed some grout and some PVA and filled in and sealed many of the fine gaps, particularly between the foam edging of the buildings and the modeling compound flagstone texture that we made in the last episode. This is a really essential process, as it just makes the whole board look a lot more seamless by adding realistic grit size of fine dirt into all those joints, and as the grout is also an adhesive, it strengthens a lot of those joints as well. It's a simple process: a seam of high-bond PVA from Geek Gaming, a heavy sprinkle of grout, brush it all into the grooves, and then I sealed the grout and the entire modeling compound stonework with a spray of isopropyl alcohol and then Geek Gaming Matte Scenic Sealant. This step is really key to make sure all the exposed modeling compound texture survives the rigors of gaming, and it activates the adhesive properties of the grout. With the first board done, I jumped onto the second one, and one awesome find in the box of rubble during the live stream was a few test pieces of modeling compound rolled flagstone. So I broke these up and smooshed them all around the sinking riverbank, which really added so much visual detail to this big rubble pile, and then repeated the grouting and sealing process for this second board. After slapping down the two fully rubbled boards together, I decided there was too much open space in the courtyard directly in front of that big bell tower, so I glued down another relic from the channel's past, the original foam carved master of my old Armon Hen centerpiece. It's so fun to put all these little Easter eggs throughout the build. I really enjoy it. And with these two boards ready for paint, I'm absolutely loving the way they're coming together. But as I'm sure many of you have noticed, there is a big old empty patch in the northwest corner, which is going to need something special to bring it to life. So this is the last big piece for this board, the massive old weapons factory from the original OSGILIATH board, and this guy is way too intact. We need to smash this apart, we need to ruin it. It looks like it's come straight out of Minas Tirith, not out of OSGILIATH. And also, there's a big old hole in the top of it. We need to create some sort of upper level structure. There's these amazing stairwells which I built all those years ago, which used to go to a kind of building that went on the top here, which is actually in the first section. We've already used that part, and that's why it's not here. So we want to build something to make the stairs go to something, because they're really cool and I think they're going to be great for gameplay. So let's add some walls, let's add some sort of flooring, some sort of structure, and smash this up so that it suits OSGILIATH.
I am Mr. LaFrankton. Welcome to my YouTube channel.
So this weapons factory is another huge relic of ages past. It is the final building that was ever finished for the original board and actually featured in the very first video on this channel. And although some of the carving work is of a much higher standard than the other stuff, it's still pretty rough. Hopefully we can really elevate it with a nice makeover and create an absolutely banger centerpiece to cap off this first finished half of the board. I grabbed a whole bunch of XPS foam sheeting and trimmed it down to 1/2 inch thick and started dreaming up
ideas for the upper story, and surprise, surprise, they quickly got out of hand. So much for a simple ruined topper. I decided to start making the floor, trimming it down to fit the nice support lip I already had from the last upper story, and I then cut an archway for the door to the external stairwell and mocked up ideas of where the first floor was heading. I then hacked out a collapsed floor outline so gamers could still get their hands in to access the bottom level, and then used a flagstone roller to give the floor some nice texture, just pressing really hardly into the foam to get that to read. It doesn't work as well as when you go into the modeling compound, but in a small section that's going to be covered with rubble, it's just a nice little bit of detail. I spruced up that detail factor with my scrunched up alfoil, and then really honed in on the ruined edging with some cracks snaking across the tiles, and then glued that floor in place, and I'm really happy with how that's looking. To mount the upper walls to the flooring, I carved a lip for a strong structural bond, and then set about carving our usual stonework pattern into the sheeting. However, this time I decided to use a bunch of bricks of different sizes to give the panel a bit more detail, as well as some accents around the archway leading to the stairs. I continued the pattern around the corners to make sure the bricks were aligned from piece to piece, and I then glued down those first 3 finished pieces and went back to the drawing board to repeat the process all over again and start planning the next floor above. And as you can see, this very small keep is quickly becoming the remains of a towering bastion. Why can't I just ever make anything small and simple?
So we've hit a bit of a milestone here. I'm finally happy after many attempts and kind of trying all sorts of different sort of profiles and outlines with the silhouette, the overall structure of the upper section of this former weapons factory. But before I go diving into carving all of these different panels, we need to work out how this piece is actually going to play. And at the moment, we've got some big old stairs that sort of just go to nowhere, and no one's really going to go up them. And the whole point of this rebuild is to motivate people to use these epic stairs. So we need to put in some sort of extra upper platform, some stairs, and then we can work out where all of the windows will go, because there need to be some upper gantry windows for archers. And then once those windows have a placement and a stairwell coordination, it's time to slice up the rest of the stonework.
So a stairwell was in order, which took me a couple of goes, but we eventually got something working up the straight section to move from the first to the second level. But I then needed to spiral the stairs around to reach the center of the front, which I did, creating little angled small stone steps that I placed individually. And now we've got the height of the second level established, we can carve in our windows and then the remaining stonework. I decided to mimic the lower level of the base piece with a large central archway, this time partially collapsed, and then a smaller archway on the small panel that sits on an angle, and then we have smaller archways again on the top floor for our elevated firing positions. I glued down the angled panel once that was carved, which helped secure the stairwell in place, and then moved on to finishing the front archway. The lower archway was super tall, which looks fantastic and also helps keep access to the lower level, but for the upper platform, I knew the ruined profile would be tapering away, so another large arch wasn't going to work here. So I carved up the upper floor platform for our second floor and glued that in place to see how much window real estate I'd need to carve, and then I decided on several tall and thin archways was the way to go, using a 25mm base as my template and opting for 3 arches. I carved them with a bunch of rich details and then glued them in place, and then finished off the front panel with a little ruined taper, which sort of built up a profile of rubble for this silhouette of the building. And I continued that down and made it all jagged over the top of the angled panel, and followed that stonework up and across the next piece, trimming it down and then detailing the edge of the broken pieces before moving on to the final set of stone panels. Instead of continuing the upper level we've started all the way around, I sloped down from the front and then made a raised corner at the back with a few more windows, but the other corner I left at the top of the first level, and then decided to carve that away even lower, which helped create an awesome ruined outline, as if some catapult shot has blasted through the top of the building and the walls have collapsed around the entry and exit wounds, firing diagonally across the structure. To take this further, and also to help blend the old foam and the new, I sort of hacked away and full on ripped out a chunk of the lower section of the original building along that same firing axis, and that really blended those and made the top structure feel a little less just plonked on top. This process also left me with some nice chunks of rubble, which I weathered down and then glued to the inside of the lower level for the beginnings of a nice rubble profile. I then grabbed my scalpel and weathered the old building itself, hacking away little chips here and there, and then smashing the old stairs to make them look worn
and damaged, and then the final detail was to add a few small pieces of stripping to further accent that kind of back boring flat section of the new building, which also helped hide some of the joins. And I then threw the building down outside onto the city, and we can see the full build journey in all its glory, and I'm reasonably happy. But now we get to make it really sing with a big old sexy prime with rattle cans. Up first is the Rust-Oleum Dark Grey Primer, just all over everything, complete coverage here. This bad boy can even be directly used on the orange polystyrene if you're careful and you don't spray it too closely and let the propellant evaporate before it hits the foam. It still does eat foam if you're not careful, but the orange foam is actually pretty resilient. Then I come in with Aged Grey, a nice lighter tone, and hit the whole city with a top-down zenithal to hit all of the raised details and leave the dark grey in the recesses. Instant detail without a single dry brush. Sometimes you can break the top-down rule when it's better for accenting details like the floor textures, for instance. I always get the cans parallel to the surface to just kiss the top of that texture, and you can do that in and around the ruins as well. Just make sure you're getting a really nice detail-centric finish. With the prime complete, I just want to shout out my amazing Patreons. These incredible people are a huge part of why any of this madness can happen. It's been really fun sharing all of the work in progress photos of this project with them on our Discord, and even doing a bunch of OSGILIATH themed giveaways for the Patreon. To become a part of the family and support the channel and go in the draw to win some sweet giveaways, check out my Patreon in the description, or simply hit the join button here on YouTube, just down there under the video next to the subscribe button. Before continuing the paint job, I drove to the storage unit and grabbed the first part of the city so I could make sure that our scheme was matching, and then I had a nice good look at the first board. Our next task is to finish the stonework, and this is once again just a super basic and simple scheme, an all over black oil wash and then a brown oil wash into the recesses and specific areas to build up grime. This paint job is just so damn simple. 2 sprays, 2 washes, finished. And with the speed at which I need to achieve stuff, it's amazing. Yes, I could do some more accent work with dry brushes and some airbrushed glazes, and one day when all of these pieces are going to go on display, I might do like a full level up, but for now, they look perfectly suitable. The brown wash is a little thinner, you kind of glaze on that grime. Sometimes you need a couple of coats, but usually one will do, but the black wash is darker and more of a splotchy stain to add both recessed detail and large discolorated sections of weathered stone. The great thing with the oils is if you go too hard with one of the stains, you can just blend it back with thinner until you're happy. I love painting like this. It's so freeing to work in such broad strokes, especially after the mental detail of the carving. The final color to go down is some Vallejo Air Blue Grey through my awesome little airbrush sent to me by Scale Modeling Supplies here in Australia. I had an absolute dream applying this color to all our roofing and to our water. I sprayed for over an hour without a single clog. I'm clearly getting better at maintaining my airbrush. The water had a gradient put down first with rattle cans just moving from black up to that light grey to create sort of a luminance value, and then the blue is applied over the top as a filter, which creates a graduated tone to hint at the depth of the water. There's lots of work to do here later on once we get to the resin pour, but that's good for now. If you want more info on that process, check out the first video from the first board, which is linked up above, and the links for the SMS airbrushes and all that gear are down in the description. Man, this city is getting me really excited. I've got so many little blue roofs all in one place, and that slate color really pops against the grey monotony of the ruins. Then the final stage, which will turn this board into a god-tier ruin of Stalingrad proportions, is rubble. I've shown this process many times before, but we've got an interesting little challenge this time around. First up, I grabbed my blend of city rubble and grimdark city rubble from the Geek Gaming Scenics range, and then smashed down a whole bunch of the fast drying basing glue. Let that dry for about 15 minutes and then just pile all the rubble on. Large sizes first, and then your smaller aggregate. Remember that the full Geek Gaming Scenics range is available from my own shop, Zorpazorp.com, linked down in the description. So check that out if you want to support the channel and get some amazing quality scenics at the same time. I moved through the whole city just piling this stuff absolutely everywhere, but over at the water side, we've got heaps of exposed foam, which needs to be pure rubble, because I actually ran out of modeling compound. So I slathered on a whole bunch of glue and spread it out with a paintbrush, and then carefully applied an even blend of aggregate, ensuring the whole surface had a really good bond. We don't want any of that gross greeny foam coming through. For the exposed foam that was almost vertical, I waited until the glue was really grabby and tacky before sprinkling down the rubble, and then
it just stuck straight to it. Looked fantastic. Then I waited overnight, tipped off all of the excess rubble and gathered it back up into my tub, and then got stuck into the final pass of sealing the board, which is the same process as the grout. Hit it with ISO and then utterly soak the whole board in Geek Gaming Matte Scenic sealant. I did this about 3 or 4 times over a 24-hour period, letting it dry and then hitting it again and again to make sure it was all locked down hard. Then once it's all dry, we get to enjoy the truly satisfying moment of whacking the full board together with both city blocks and then having a bit of a play with the modular layout. We can now see how the different city sections can be swapped around for a bunch of different setups, and we can even have a look at the first iteration of the opposing riverbanks, and that's only going to get bigger and cooler as this board gets larger. We of course need to now pour an absolute heap of resin on the board to make it truly flooded. We are finally attempting the biggest resin pour I've ever heard of. 40 kilos of epoxy resin is going down all over this Lord of the Rings Wargaming board as we turn OSGILIATH into a truly flooded city. The final glorious detail to bring this flooded city to life. It is resin time, baby. Now, I've done a lot of setup work here to really sell this resin flooded city street effect with buildings sinking into the river and whole portions of the riverbed collapsing away, so I think we can really achieve a good look. But before I bring the 35 kilos of resin near my beloved scenery, we need to do some safety tests. So I grabbed a whole bunch of materials, basically everything I've used to make the board so far, and knocked together a little mini riverbank, still mounting sheeting down onto a pine frame just like I did to build the big board so we can test our gate methods. And then for the riverbank, I used a mix of that green structural polystyrene foam and orange detailed finish foam, and then also applied some of my adhesives into pools so I can test out how watertight and how safe and unreactive all of the ingredients in my build are going to be. We've got 2 adhesives at play here, the standard construction adhesive, or liquid nails as we call it here in Australia, and a new type of sealant that's designed to be used in the middle of a storm for sealing leaking water. The gate system around the edge of the river will be a seam of liquid nails, some foam core sheeting, and then a seam of this black storm sealant for 3 layers of resin protection. The sealant is not built for resin, but it will hopefully be great at stopping any scary leaks mid-pour. With this in mind, I got some of the parts painted just like the board and jumped into testing before giving it too much drying time to see just how the piece would hold up under duress. To fully test out our riverbank style, I threw down some fast drying basing glue and then chucked some grimdark city rubble and city rubble blend straight into the glue, and then it was time to start mixing our resin. Now, I've made a few water features over the years, but not for quite a long time. I always use epoxy resin as it's usually completely foam safe, unlike polyester resins, which literally dissolved my first OSGILIATH riverbank the very first time I ever tried to make a river. And recently, the folks over at Barnes have developed a new type of epoxy resin called Megapore. This beast has a working life of 2 hours and a cure time of 24 hours, so there's heaps of time for bubbles to escape, and it's not going to set on me too quickly. Ages ago, I bought a 3.5 kilo kit to attempt the first build, and then Barnes, when they heard about the project, sent over a full 30 kilo kit, so we are armed to the teeth with epoxy resin. So a big thanks to the team over at Barnes. It's mixed in a 2-to-1 ratio by weight, so I smashed down some part A, half as much part B, mixed them together until they turned clear again after the 2 components combine, and then threw it down into part 1, and then mixed up a second batch. You'll notice that I've airbrushed the riverbank section just like our real river, and that's because I want to test some pigments and see how they look over that dark blue pattern, and I've got some proper resin pigments from Barnes that I had for an old project. This one is chocolate brown, but when I put it in, it was actually a lot redder than I was hoping, and when I threw it down over the blue, it did not get the river look I was going for, so I just added some acrylic blue and yellow to use a bit of color theory to give me some brown, and blended that in as well. It was at this point I realized I definitely had a leak in the gate for the red-brown compartment, which might seem small, but it's pretty much fatal if left unattended because of how long this resin stays runny for. A perfect test though for our storm sealant. I slapped that all over the place, and it was a complete failure. That is not going to stop resin from leaking. The hydrophobic nature of silicon-based sealants make them amazing at repelling water at a molecular level, but they're not doing much to resin beyond being a physical barrier. So when they're not fully dry, it's pretty much useless for us. With more leaks springing up all over the place on this test piece, I experimented a bit more with our clear pool by adding some blue, and that yielded some really promising results. I probably should have tried the blue-grey like our actual airbrush color, but we'll test that out as we start doing the real pour.
So the whole purpose of doing this test piece is to kind of put some of my fears to rest and test out a few of the different materials and methods to kind of really help my anxiety about throwing 30 kilos of resin down on the main boards. Unfortunately, it hasn't really done that. The good thing we have learned is I've had a bit of a play whacking in some acrylics. It does actually look pretty interesting. But the sealing and the leaks, which is what we're all here to see, right, is looking grim. The brownie red one has just leaked completely. There was obviously a hole in this wall and it's just gone right out, and probably gonna have to go back to smashing on hot glue, which is the old school method for that. But we've also since then now got a leak somewhere out the corner here, which I don't really know where that's coming from, in the blue one. So everything's leaking, everything's kind of not working. I guess it's time to pour all 30 kilos of resin on the main board.
So with the utter failure of the previous gate system, it's time for an upgrade to our dam wall approach. The last thing we need is a pesky ent or dog-themed siege weapon bursting it open. My first port of call is a full wraparound seam of painter's masking tape. This stuff is strong and non-porous, adhesive side down to the timber. Then where the edge of that tape meets the timber, a thick vein of Selly's liquid nails, which did show promising resin-repelling signs when it was actually cured properly. Then our foam board sheeting, which is mostly there for structural integrity than resin proofing, but it forces the adhesive into a thick gapless seal, and then 2 or 3 overlapping seams of hot glue around the base of the core board. One layer down entirely, then another over the lip of that first layer, and then a third layer along the top lip of the first layer next to the core board. Oh my goodness, so much hot glue. I then started panicking about resin seeping under the stonework of the board itself, so I decided to seal the entire riverbank with another seam of glue, this time our fast-drying basing glue, and then sprinkled in some more city rubble base ready, and this just gives us another layer of protection, and to be honest, it looks better anyway. I should have always done it like that, with a bit of rubble coming off those edges. I also used this to cover up any of the screws that were showing in the water section from drilling down the board, as well as the center line join on the second board, where I had to use 2 timber sheets instead of 1 large one. I sealed that down with isopropyl alcohol and Geek Gaming matte scenic sealant, using a pipette this time to ensure maximum penetration of the substrate for a good seal, and then realized my design had like a massive flaw. With Larissa's help, she got me to lift the board up. We set about relining the entire inner structure of the timber frame beneath with construction adhesive. I worked out that if the resin got past the first layer of our defenses, the tape, it could potentially find micro cracks where our timber sheeting was mounted to the pine frame and leak to the inside of the board, just bypassing all of our defensive measures, which would not be ideal, but I think that's pretty good now. I added all of the same gate methods to our second board: tape, then liquid nails, then foam core, then hot glue, and yet more hot glue. And maybe, just maybe, we might be ready for resin.
So we're about 36 hours into this build journey now. I've done all of the gates across the boards and let them dry overnight as well, so that they've got a really strong bond between all 4 of those defensive mechanisms. But I'm still very nervous. It's a lot of resin to go down. My original plan was to just do a little seam around the edge and test for leaks and maybe even let that cure before the big pour. But I, as definitely me, all by myself, have had an amazing idea. I'm putting epoxy resin down. Epoxy resin is the big 40 kilo pour. Why don't I seal the inside edges of the gates with epoxy resin, but not 24-hour pouring resin, 5-minute adhesive resin. It dries clear, it makes a little seam, it will completely go hard super fast, and then once all the other resin's down on top, we're never gonna see a thing. And I definitely thought of this all by myself.
So yeah, a big shout out to Lukey from Geek Gaming, who called me at like 4 a.m. in the morning after I posted some work in progress photos to our Zorpazorp community Facebook group to scream at me for not making an inner seam lining with epoxy. So I grabbed 10 packets of 5-minute epoxy from Bunnings and started smashing it all over those edges. I tested it first to make sure that it was in fact clear and wasn't going to yellow, and then we're good to go. A real focus here is getting a lip of resin sliding up the tape. Obviously it's going to level back down, and then jamming it into all the nooks and crannies, especially our biggest weak points, which is the edges of the board, where the river gates join to the land. I was worried about how the hard lip of the meniscus is going to look, because I kind of intended to go back here and tease that down to make that sort of lump really flat and join with the board, but I sort of totally forgot about how fast it was going to dry. But anyway, we can't help it now. I grabbed my spirit level to make sure the boards were level, had to do a little bit of chalking to get it perfectly straight, and then it is finally time to pour some damn resin in the River Anduin. We started strong with a fantastic yeet of the Part B tub spewing uncooked hardener all over the desk, and then reset and tried again a little more calmly on a flatter section of the table and mixed up our first sizable batch of epoxy resin. Nothing massive here, as we're just doing that little seam pour around the edges. I did, however, throw in some acrylic paint to start tinting it, this time using that blue-grey that originally went through the airbrush, and man, it just looks so much better. I started throwing this all around the edges, pushing it up to the tape to cover over the 5-minute epoxy and test out just how strong that seal really is. I had to be careful when pushing around that I didn't scratch the paintwork underneath, so I ended up using a nice soft piece of foam core. That was the way to go there, but I mixed up more and more batches, getting that seam all the way around the edge, and experimenting with different ratios of pigment as well, getting better and better results as it got darker and darker. I just thought I found a leak, but we're okay. It was just a spill on the table. So that is our baby pour done, and it's been about 10 minutes and there's no leak. So that means we've got no kind of catastrophic problems, no big holes that are being immediately exposed by the resin. Now I think what I'm going to do is leave this about half an hour to an hour and just see if there's any tiny micro cracks that are going to be a leak. If there's not, then we'll complete this layer so that it's one consistent skin of resin, very, very thin, only a couple of millimeters. So that way that, you know, as it starts to dry, there's no weird tidal marks through. That'll be another test of those joins. And then in about 8 to 12 hours after that, which we know from our test piece, which is somewhere behind me, that's when we start to get hardening. Then we'll do the big layer. I think this might be working. After throwing down that next layer of resin, I smoothed it into the seam resin with no trouble at all. This early in the curing process, it's all still very low viscosity. Then I started experimenting with some different blues and greys and blended that into these mid regions, and with a little stippling and swooshing, that all joined together nicely too. Then about 16 hours later, that foundation was firm to the touch, and we officially have that base layer of about 3 millimeters down all over the board with no leaks. I'm absolutely flabbergasted. The epoxy resin seam has done some huge work for us. Now it was time to start mixing some bigger batches. Over this next phase of the mega pour, I worked in 3 to 4 kilo batches at a time to make sure that I was still getting really well mixed ingredients and the pigments as well, and that's kind of a handy size for the different layers I'm going to be doing, as you'll see. It feels pretty badass to be literally mixing buckets of epoxy resin to pour on the board at a time. I wanted to start going darker here to build up the depths of the river, so I added more blue and engine grey to our first batch and threw that down into our first board as a bit of a mid-tone. Then I mixed up a very desaturated and clear batch with a tiny bit of blue and a medium amount of grey to sort of soften the clarity a little, and then poured this into the shallows, finally spilling resin up and over the lower street, submerging those cobblestones and also around the flooded parts of the tilting buildings. While I had this clear stuff out, I threw that down into the shallows of the second board around the riverbanks and over the submerged rubble. Then I wanted to make a darker batch for an even deeper section of the water, and here I made my first big error of the pour. I threw in some blue, and then I thought it would be nice to try out some black to get that darkness, and I kind of went off to the workshop for a minute or two to dig around for that paint, but I forgot to mix the blue first, and so that just sat on the top and created a bit of a skin, and then I came back and started mixing the black in without even sort of checking that it had dried on the surface, and all of that blue paint just became dry, large particles blasted through the resin, and they just would not dissolve no matter how much I mixed it in. Not wanting to throw out 3 kilos of resin, I just poured it in anyway, and it was actually much darker and required a lot of massaging to blend into the mid-tone, but over time it ended up looking really good, but the little bright blue flecks of paint were everywhere. Over the rest of the day, I was constantly fishing them out when I saw really large ones, and all the small ones will hopefully not get noticed under future layers of resin. To enable a high pour on the second board, I had to extend that masking tape layer all the way around the lip, which was a little bit scary, but oh well. And then I slapped in some of that dark stuff and then another mid-tone color to really start bringing up the overall height of that board, and I'm really enjoying where that water level is sitting in and around the submerged pieces of the city.
Pours had been going pretty well, but it's not the proper resin experience if we don't get a serious leak, right? This bad boy here, out the back, I kind of suspected this and I forgot to put a seam of glue up the back or something. I managed to sort of stop it here, but all that's done is shunt the resin down, and I'm up to like my 8th or 9th attempt at making a gate, and you can see, look at that right there, that is more resin on the table. So it's time to just try and save this leak.
I sealed the leak with some hot glue and some 5-minute epoxy, and hopefully that's going to hold over the next 24 to 48 hours. It was about 16 hours in when the first pour started going firm, so that's the really scary period, but it pretty much has to last that whole time to survive the pressure of the weight of the resin. So far though, I'm really happy with the look of the boards, and now it's just time for the nervous wait. If there's going to be any disaster monsoons of resin all over my garage floor, now is when it's going to happen. And I think that maybe the second board might be a little bit too blue, even for Peter Jackson's very blue Anduin, but I'm hoping that when the wave layer goes down on the top of this, that sort of desaturates it a little bit, but we shall see. In the meantime, cross your fingers for me, everyone, and I'll see you on the other side.
It's too much! What am I supposed to do with this? I like it big here on Zorpazorp, stupidly massive, some might say, but today, Games Workshop have really upped the ante. Last year, GW's Middle-earth team sent me 12 of the Dol Guldur scenery kits, and we knocked up a nice little diorama, but as you all know, the biggest, baddest project on YouTube is the Zorpazorp Siege of Gondor megaboard, a massive Lord of the Rings diorama.
Absolutely massive.
From OSGILIATH through the Pelennor Fields, all the way up to Minas Tirith in one mega layout. We've been working with people from all over the world for the last 2 years to bring this project to life, including a whole bunch of other YouTubers. And when Games Workshop decided they were designing a brand new OSGILIATH scenery kit, they asked me if I wanted any. Yes please, but I am a little confused. I asked Games Workshop for 25 boxes of the new ruin so that I could add another 2 city blocks to our existing city, and that will take us to 40 square feet of just OSGILIATH. But this is a lot more plastic than 25 ruins. It's a literal mountain of sprue in front of me. I've never seen this much Warhammer in one place before in my life. I think it's time we dive in and find out what I've just unpacked. Orcs. Morannon orcs. So many trolls. Why would any person need this many trolls? Here we go. So we do have the ruins in both sets of sprues. I don't know how many there are. There's a lot. Yep, trolls, rangers, men of Gondor, Mordor orcs, heaps of ruins. And yep, here we go. The new heroes are here as well. I don't know how many of each. I can see Faramirs, the Rangers, Gothmogs. So I think what this is it's a whole lot of battles of OSGILIATH that have all just been dumped as sprue in one box. Let's jump into time-lapse, count up everything that's here, and then we're gonna work out what the bloody hell we're gonna do with all this. $72, $88, $92, $98, $100. What is going on? 100 sprues of ruin. Each box, I think, has 2 sprues. That is 50 of these single ruin kits. Double what I asked for. And then there are 4 of each of the heroes. Gothmog, Faramir, the other 2 rangers, and then there is a whole load of sprues, 26 Mordor trolls, 300 warriors of Minas Tirith, 288 rangers, and just a casual 600 orcs. What am I supposed to do with this? The troops are a whole thing. That's a whole separate thing. I was not expecting any troops. I just asked for scenery. I think what's happened is they thought I was asking for 25 Battle of Osgiliath box sets. Or maybe they didn't and they just went, Lockie can just make an army. It's fine, because I mean, we need an army. It's a massive board, hundreds and hundreds of square feet of scenery that needs to be covered by troops. So having this huge army, there's definitely something really cool we can do with that. But for now, we're just gonna put that all aside. I'm gonna stew on that, and it's time to start assembling all of these kits. Now this scenery is, as always, the new standard, this incredible high quality, Ray Dranfield designed modular mastery. But oh my goodness, does clipping it off the sprue, it was painful enough when there were 12 of them with the Dol Guldur, okay? I ain't doing 50 kits, 100 sprues by myself. We're gonna need some help. I think it's time to get in the car.
So we're here today at the Conflict Colours dungeon here in Brizzy. I have recruited the lads, and it is time to assemble a whole lot of plastic kits. 100 sprues! Let's see if we can get them all done by the end of the day. Let's meet the team.
Hey, I'm Ryan. If I roll a 1, she's cool.
Hi, I'm Sam. Legolas, just awesome. Hey, I'm John.
Hi, I'm Jacques, and I got the lads over to my hobby dungeon for some sprue time. He did. That's a dick move, man. That's a dick move.
Hello, Papa.
With the full team under the watchful guise of safety supervisor Ellie the Labrador, the boys and I dived into smashing through as much plastic as possible, alternating between breaking and cutting off the sprue and cleaning up the sprue gate joins, and of course sorting all the pieces into a bunch of organizer storage trays, which we quickly realized were not big enough. Switching up tasks and working as a group or in pairs really helped to break up the monotony, plus it meant we could all keep a watchful eye on John and Jacques, who kept on trying to clean every single mold line, and there ain't no time for that on this job. All we need to do is clean up the parts enough so that they'll glue together neatly.
Stop focusing on Jacques' ass. On John's hand, please. What do you think of the kit so far, dude?
Really detailed. Like, really detailed. Yeah, they're really nice. I really like all the little column detail that they've got in them.
Really well sculpted and a lot of modularity, which is really good.
5 lads working all day. I don't know, does it look like a lot of work, boys?
It doesn't.
All of this is still left.
With only 37 of 100 frames cleaned up on the first day, the following weekend we threw ourselves back into the maelstrom in one final attempt to break the back of the preparation before the real build could begin. One of the great advantages of this mammoth task is that we quickly became intimately acquainted with all of the various types of bits and parts.
Tired, but pretty impressed with what we've done.
So it's 1 AM at the end of day 2. I think we worked out with all the people here, it's like an equivalency of over 60 hours of labor for one person, and it just doesn't look like very much. It's just like a few tubs of plastic. We have 19 left of 100 frames. We have finished 81. There's still more. Well, we can't do any more tonight. We're done. It's time to go and get some sleep.
Back in the studio, it's finally time to start assembly, but where do we begin? With Lord of the Rings, of course.
So here in Premiere, I have every single shot where Osgiliath appears in the films, and now we can sort of scrub through and get a really good sample of all of the visual film references in one place. Let's see if we can find a really key structure to kind of start us off and begin our build journey. Our first instance is, of course, Boromir's big speech. We've got some lovely wide shots here. There's lots of really, really useful shapes in the backgrounds of these plates. This is the miniature that's been composited behind Sean Bean. The back here of this big, large courtyard is definitely a potential candidate, I think. It looks really, really cool. We're back now here in the conflict during the Two Towers, and we've got some really nice shots looking over the river. The big flyover. This is such a great reference for the geography of the whole city, and I've taken inspiration from this so many times. This sequence is another staple for reference. I've looked at this so many times. It's a really great wide shot, and there's some great buildings in here we can draw on too. That's a fantastic wide shot. So much there to look at. All right, I've got some ideas. Let's get some plastic and start smashing it together.
So with that inspiration loosely in mind, I started diving into the kits, and we've got a whole bunch of pieces to work with. Solid walls, single and double arch windows, murder hole style windows, and then ruined versions of all of those, as well as floor tiles that are both intact and heavily ruined. Interestingly, there is no stairs, no balustrades, no roofing, and not a single open archway. The closest we have is a solid door piece, which I had to go at cutting out, which is certainly doable and took me about 3 minutes per tile. We're going to start with a nice 4x4 square tower, which tapers off to a slim corridor, and my approach here with this first building is to just build with absolute freedom. I have made huge boards out of GW plastic kits many times, and I'm always rationing my pieces to make sure I get the best possible structure from the pieces I have, but this time, with the sheer volume of plastic I've been sent, it means that at least for these key hero buildings, the sky is literally the limit. The foundation of this first tower is a great proof of concept of all the techniques we're going to need throughout this entire build. First of all, fully modular removable levels. That is massive. This just locks into place. It looks absolutely fantastic, and then it comes straight off. Great for gameplay. We can get our hands in there. It's also great for filming. It makes storage great. It's absolutely awesome. The way this kit facilitates that is mind-blowing. Ray Dranfield, you're a god. I'm a very, very happy man. We've also got the ability to create these lovely ruined, blasted out holes by flipping over the ruined tiles, and that's huge. That's massive, because it allows us to keep a good ratio of intact walls and ruined wall pieces so that we don't get 2/3 of the way through the build, building these big, tall, vertical structures, and then run out of solid pieces and only be able to make ruins. So that is absolutely massive. The other factor that's really important is I've been able to make my first level 2 wall tiles high so that I can keep building up without wasting floor tiles. It also doesn't turn into a really congested skyscraper, and those sort of join really solidly, and so that's working really well too. So let's continue on with this tower. We'll smash upwards, get some more verticality, and then plow on with the rest of the build. I continued upwards, adding the next level of walls to the first floor to get that double height, and then began to bring in our ruined walls that would eventually taper to a jagged point on the smaller upper levels. Then with that level done, I made another floor tile, still to the full shape of the tower, but with a really large hole in the middle and yet more ruined floor tiles, and then began work on the second removable level walls, adding more and more damage and ruined sections, and leaving another gap in the floor tiles for a stairwell to come up through, just like we did on the level below. Before fully completing this tower, I was struck by an idea to incorporate a third tower from the 2 we'd initially planned from our reference, but this time joined by an upper walkway that would join to this level, essentially turning the building into a big L with this current tower in the center. So I decided to leave this area for now and start working on the foundation of the central chamber and the second tower. As you can see from the base, this second tower is going to be much more ruined than the first, tapering a ruined profile all the way up to the top level to capture that classic OSGILIATH skyline of jagged stone. As such, the flooring of each level is going to be even more ruined, with heaps of intact squares made from the broken little pieces that all glue together but have heaps of holes and exposed timber beams. Due to the awesome archway facade on the lower level, the bottom section is going to see a lot of play, so I wanted this corridor super damaged from the get-go, but with so many ruined pieces and 2 ends that are open, there wasn't a lot of structural integrity, so I cut apart 2 more of our archway tiles and used them to become an internal wall, which also allowed me to smash up one of the door pieces and use it to pan out the flooring, which dramatically increased the strength of the piece. I actually love how much these internal walls have added, and I might try and use that a bit more throughout the whole build. I continued the walls up to get it to double height as per our modular system, and you can see how nicely it locks into the first tower with the tongue and groove connectors holding it firmly in place. I then made a second level for the corridor, even more damage than the first, completely leaving one side open to the elements to create some fantastic gameplay access and a really interesting aesthetic, and then it was time to return to the second tower. So I made quite a lot of flooring but used heavily ruined tiles with small holes that still all interconnected, and then finished off this tower with a very small final level and was going to just glue this in place, but it was too small to be stable. It sort of tipped over a bit, so I grabbed my magnetization kit from the magnetbaron.com and used some super magnets in the pillars to secure it in place. Removable and solid. Perfect. Look at that jagged profile. I am absolutely loving that tower, but now to really elevate the piece, let's finish off the first tower and set up that epic verticality Zorpazorp is known for. I finished off the second level, leaving an open doorway where the upper terrace is going to join, and created a really nice damaged stone pattern featuring our first intact hole that sort of spanned across 3 levels of tiles, and then I smashed the next floor, starting to go super ruined as we reduced the cross-sectional area, but kept the walls fairly solid so that I could build one more final floor and take the full height of this central tower to a whopping 9 tiles high. A personal record for me for GW skyscraper kit bashing if we measure the record by tiles used and not overall height. And there we have our first 2 towers completely assembled, and I am loving this kit. But now things get really spicy as we begin to make our first ever Middle-earth gangway. Zorptrons familiar with my 40k urban city build will be well acquainted for my penchant for elevated terraces and passageways between buildings, and I couldn't resist making one for this build. Plus, it will keep the courtyard below much more open for gameplay. This was a really fun kind of mini build, going for super damage so that units inside could see the things down below really easily, and it just looks badass.
This is absolutely massive.
With the gangway locked into the central tower, now it's time to work out where the building goes from here and how on earth it's going to fit in with the full OSGILIATH gaming board. Then we have over 2/3 of the ruined kits left to work with. There is so much plastic kit bashing ahead of us. So our first job is to slap together that third tower. I decided to make this tower far more ruined than the first 2 we'd built, almost completely collapsed on one side, which is super accessible for gameplay, but still intact enough to facilitate our key stairwells so models can reach that precious gangway. In a slightly odd process, I actually worked backwards, going from top down to the bottom, starting with the point where the gangway met the tower. I got a nice little pointy top level and then fleshed out the base. Man, look at this beast. Loving the pants off that. With the centerpiece coming along nicely, now we need to pause the plastic crack for a moment to prepare the actual gaming board. Just like the first 2 city blocks of OSGILIATH, I built up a pine reinforced gaming board with masonite sheets and then smashed down our usual 1-inch foam sheets. The timber frame not only helps keep the board super solid, but it gives us a place to mount our gates for when we cover this entire board in a massive resin pour. As I threw down the board, it really dawned on me that as probably the only person in the world outside of Warhammer World to have this many pieces of this scenery, it was my duty to show you guys something really special and unique. We've got a fantastic mega building with that centerpiece, and I've really fallen in love with the idea of rooftop combat. I'm already imagining scenarios where Gondorian forces barricade themselves in holdout positions and try to hold the upper levels of critical structures while the lower levels are just swarming with orcs. And so with that in mind, I settled on a layout with the massive centerpiece straddling the center line of my 5x4 foot city block, with the 2 large towers on the short 2x4 half at the back of the board, and the single tower connected to the gangway sitting right on the river's edge. Now it's time to figure out how we use the remaining mountain of plastic to fill in the negative space. And the obvious and most important place to start is the docks and the water's edge. This region is going to see the most critical gameplay for Gothmog's amphibious assault, and I've already got some exciting little seeds of an idea, but to grow them into a fully fledged plan, we must return to our reference material. So we're back here in Premiere with all of the OSGILIATH footage from the Lord of the Rings. We're really going to hone in on all of the scenes that are really close to the river's edge. There's some nice little low barricades, obviously the bridges, a little bit of a dock there, and then we've got some lovely buildings in the background, which are kind of the vibe that we're looking for, I think. Here's another really nice shot as the hobbits are leaving OSGILIATH and the 2 towers. Best stuff is the amphibious assault by Gothmog right here in Return of the King. These lovely elevated positions right over the water's edge. Lovely hero building here coming down to the water. Oh, we should try and make that building so the dude can get shot in it. They're not coming from the north. Another amazing water level wide shot here. This is golden. As I poured over all the amazing shots of the city literally inundated with water, I felt a bit underwhelmed by what I'd actually built so far with the first city blocks. Sure, I've got some collapsing buildings that are sliding down into the Anduin, but nothing really captures that absolutely
inundated city fighting vibe. We need to see soldiers battle it out in half a meter of water, skirmishing through deeper and shallower pools of treacherous stone, with the warriors fighting as much against the hostile footing of the submerged stonework as the blades of their opponents. And as I sat staring at the negative space bracketed by the large L-shaped centerpiece, I had what I like to call a Lockie moment, a little spark of inspiration that in the space of a single breath ignites into this raging inferno of hobby mojo, where suddenly I just see the whole project before me and yet another stupidly massive hobby dream is born. If we pick the orientation for the 3 towers so the single tower is closest to the river and then shunt it hard up against one board edge, we can create a tiered terrace of city streets that is half an inch lower than the normal city height. We still have to keep the edges 1 inch high so it tessellates with the rest of the board, but now we can fill this lower platform with a network of smaller structures that are interlinked with small gangways for a completely different gaming experience to the massive towers, and slope this mini city sector with the broader board down towards the river, having much more of it inundated with resin when we do the big pour. After sketching out the plan, I leapt back to my hobby bench, re-enthused to smash more plastic kits together, and started picking out small structures from either the films or my reference book collection and started banging them out in plastic form.
Now, it was about this time I got a little notification in YouTube Studio that I wasn't the only one to receive these plastic kits early. None other than the mighty Play on Tabletop were making their own OSGILIATH board to finally begin their Middle-earth content. If you don't know Nick and the lads, they make insanely high quality battle reports for 40k and lots of other games, and they are finally diving into Middle-earth. But I cannot wait to see their first battle report and their build. The video's down in the description. Go and check it out, give them a like and subscribe, and then come back here and tell me which board is best. Let the build-off commence!
The big change with these small buildings is that I've broken the stairwell across 2 levels. Stairwell, platform 1 wall up, and then a second stairwell, which creates some really fun L-shaped stairs. For the time being, I'm leaving the stairs blank, and we'll add those later by carving them out of foam. I mocked up a layout on the waterside half and then set about working on the foundation of our sinking, tilting city sector. I cut out a section of green XPS where our subsector will be inserted, but kept the edging to line up with the other boards as we've discussed, and glued those components down to the Masonite and Pine gaming board with liquid nails. Then I masked up, grabbed my hot wire cutter, and set about slicing up a bunch of carvable orange XPS foam. I cut this big block down into half an inch thick sheets, which had to be 14 centimeters high so they could slide beneath my hot wire cutter, and then grabbed the incredible angle cutting guide from Shifting Lands and started slicing a series of tapers into the various foam layers. With those cut out, I grabbed some more liquid nails and ran a seam all the way around the inside of the city sector to keep that nice and sealed for the resin, and then glued down my sheeting. I raised up the very highest section with a little bit of foam card spacing underneath, so we've got a nice flowing taper from the highest point all the way down into the water's edge. The final layer is very thin, just enough to take some texture. Then back in the studio, I grabbed some foam blocks and cut some stairs to descend from that upper section down into our lower level, ensuring that they were tall enough so that when I lay down some modeling compound road texture on those upper layers, it will still be a nice lip that transfers seamlessly, and then I glued those all down in place. Up next, I cut some more long stripping to be a lovely retaining wall to continue those stairs, carving that with our nice standard stonework texture and hitting it with some scrunched up alfoil. Gluing those down in place, it's now time to work on the finer details, namely the texture of the ground surface. I decided to go for some old school fun here, namely because I'm an idiot, and I tried to hand draw out a flagstone pattern, which does look really good, especially when you start cutting out and repositioning some of all the tiling and slabs and making the flagstones look like they're sliding around into the river, but it just takes so long. So once I'd completed those lower 2 levels, I just grabbed my texture rollers and I rolled out the rest, changing the pattern so it looked like different blocks of stonework. This is all going to be covered in ruins, rubble, and resin anyway. All of the cuts between the layers of foam are going to need to be covered with some sort of flagstone trim, but we'll deal with that once we've finished all of the buildings above. That way we're only covering what needs to be covered and we're only covering what can be seen. Speaking of plastic, after lining up the layout perfectly with the 3rd tower, which will join to this subsector with yet another gangway, I glued down all of the plastic first floors with liquid nails tiles, and then built some more nice ruined gangways to join the various mini buildings together and get that epic floor is lava vibe going. I tried to make these gangways really quite damaged, as they're sort of the most exposed elements of the buildings, and I'm super happy with how this is all coming along.
But I've discovered a bit of a major problem. I've been building with absolute freedom. I said in the last video when we were working on the big tower, I've got so many kits, I just want to go crazy and not worry about the logistics of managing the parts and the different types of plastic crack. But I have discovered a severe part deficiency. When we look at these buildings I've already built, I'm doing everything 2 levels high, 1 level of flooring every 2 wall tiles, but I've still been adding in these decorative joiners. I sort of just did it without thinking. It looks really great and it's what you're supposed to do, but of course they are there to cover the edging of where the floor tiles sit on top of the walls. So now I basically have none of those decorative tiles left because I've got a huge whacked out ratio between those decorative pieces and the floor tiles and the wall tiles. So if I keep building more structures, I'm gonna have this huge gap of open seam of undetailed plastic anytime I put flooring onto a wall. So I don't really know what I'm going to do about that.
So I started building up, moving around this first floor of ruins, adding upper levels, and I really fell in love with cutting out yet more of the door pieces here and adding them in at the top of any stairwell that accessed a lower level. There's going to be some heroic warriors of Gondor holding these doorways as their city is overrun below them. With the second layer of wall tiles for this first floor, I decided to skip those trim layers we talked about, and it looks absolutely fine. I probably should have been doing this the entire time to save on those parts. It certainly isn't as sexy as having all that detail in there, but using all of those parts is going to mean that I'm eventually going to need to add foam stripping to the last few buildings on this board to make up for the deficit I've created. You just have to be careful when gluing pieces down like this, as it isn't as strong of a bond, as there's no locking pegs and the pieces don't auto-align, so if you're not careful, they can slip around as they're drying. I added our first and second floor to this sector, and I don't think we'll go this high universally, but I do like a few super elevated positions. Then I decided to make yet another gangway, just one this time, on the very top level of this new sector, just for some extra crisscrossy magic right up at the higher level. Then I decided I needed just a few more ruin structures to go even further out into the water, so I whipped up 2 more ruins that are super one-sided, as if the remains have collapsed into the river, and then I mounted them to the main structure by, yep, you guessed it, yet more gangways. These buildings have no stairwell, so they're only going to be accessible from within the city, which means it's a great spot for some valiant rangers of Gondor to be sniping the orc rafts on their approach, but they're almost certainly going to be trapped unless they rapidly retreat across the rooftops. There's just going to be a really cool little sequence for gameplay, I think. Then, with those in place, I slapped down the 3 massive towers onto the board behind so we could get a nice feeling for everything that was done so far, and I'm finally starting to feel like we are truly capturing OSGILIATH on the tabletop. The composition of these buildings and the way that they inhabit the space together, it really feels like a shot straight out of the films, but we are only just over halfway through our full supply of plastic OSGILIATH pieces, so there are some epic buildings left to create.
After a fierce fortnight of work, what once began as a series of small ruins has evolved into the beginnings of the single biggest Games Workshop plastic structure on the planet outside of Warhammer World.
We've got a massive 3-tower centerpiece and our dock sector sinking into the Anduin, and yet somehow I have only used half of the plastic the GW sent me. So today we are taking this build to completion as we knock over not only this mental board, but the final sector of the OSGILIATH gaming board and the final half of the Siege of Gondor mega board. We have got a lot to do. It's best we get cracking.
So it's time to start putting all our spare plastic crack to work and start finishing off this city. So I grabbed a Sharpie, traced around our current buildings, and then started mocking up a plan for our city layout just into the structural polystyrene layer. But before we build any new buildings, we need to start mounting our 3 massive towers to their foundation. I started with the 3rd tower closest to the river and trimmed down some extruded polystyrene into a thin sheet and cut a nice large flagstone pattern with a sexy little edging and glued down the lower level of that tower with liquid nails. As this foundation actually continues down into the river, I decided this was a great opportunity to help integrate our plastic kits into the foam landscape. So I cut down several of the wall pieces and continued the outer wall down into the water. That's going to look just great with some resin sploshing up against it. I then continued the foam retaining wall to blend the plastic wall tiles into the lower city, carving and texturing them with a pencil and scrunched out alfoil as normal, and I then realized that my grand plan of joining Tower 3 to the lower city had a teeny weeny flaw. Namely, there was a solid wall piece where there needed to be a door for the new gangway. So I smashed that part of the walls apart, cut a new door piece into an archway, and then glued that all back together, ensuring that I left enough room for the floor tiles of the gangway to slot into the second level when it was placed on top. Because of the height difference, I made a little wacky gangway with some stairs from chopped up bits of floor tiles, and now we have our two separate building structures completely joined. The floor is lava continues. As this lower city sector is so close to completion, I thought I'd pause my new foundation work to add all the fine detail here and sliced up a whole bunch of foam stripping with the hot wire cutter and glued it down all over those seams in the foam flooring we did in the last video. Nice long strips over the big bits and then short strips on all the exposed joins between the absolute warren of buildings we've created. While those dried, I sliced up a whole bunch of extra floor tiles of all sorts of shapes and sizes to really pad out that sinking and sliding city foundation right down at the water's edge. I glued these down in super wibbly wobbly patterns to convey the treacherous edges of the city floor that hasn't yet tumbled down into the riverbed. With the trim dry, I went back and carved in a whole little row of tiles, widening the grout lines with a pencil, and then heavily weathering the trim and the tiles with a foil ball to impart that rocky texture, as well as really smooshing them and lowering the profile down to the flagstones. And then I realized I want even more damage and kind of deeper regions for pools of resin to sort of pour in the middle of that lower city, so I hacked up a few sections down to the bedrock layer to create some dangerous sinkholes. With the lower level finally complete and ready for paint, it's time to return to our foundation. To finish off the top half of the riverside of the board, I grabbed some Geek Gaming modeling compound and started rolling out that classic flagstone texture to create my ground surface. I've used this technique many times now on the channel, and to be honest, after I rolled all that foam layer down on the lower city below, which was just like so quick and easy, I'd started to doubt whether the effort of rolling out all this modeling compound and then trimming it down with foam and sealing it and grouting it was really worth it. But wait until you see how different both layers look once they are painted. I left room for the foundation of the third tower and then cut and glued that into place, and then as I was going along before each group of compound hadn't fully set, I cut away my edges to leave room for that all-important foam edging. If you haven't seen me do this before, welcome! You must be new around here, or perhaps an old hand returning. Smash that like button if you love how this is looking so far. But yeah, essentially this foam edging helps protect the compound, which is super strong when it's used as a molded landform, which is what the product is designed for, but when you roll it out super thin, it can get a little bit of brittle and sort of prone to impacts. I also finished off the retaining walls on the riversides and then carved and textured all the trim once that had dried in place, and then got into the super satisfying grouting phase. Normally I just use this phase to fill in any micro grooves between the layers and bind it all together seamlessly, as of course grout is an excellent adhesive, but there is also another place we regularly see grout. Yes, that's right, it's your mum's shower, or at least that's where I saw it last, and it is amazing for making the lower city even more resin proof to prevent leaks moving through the underlayers to the back of the board, so seams of PVA go down and then sprinklings of grout all over the place, and then cooking it off with isopropyl alcohol and a whole heap of matte scenic sealant. Now, one of my qualms with this current kit is that it doesn't come with any stairs, although it looks like we'll probably be getting some in the future from Games Workshop. Many savvy people who have received their OSGILIATH boxes so far have noticed the ruined frames are labeled A and D. Where are B and C, Games Workshop? And there are some pictures of buildings made from these kits with some juicy extra features like stairs, balustrades, and roofing in the new starter box, so hopefully we're getting some more of these Ray Dranfield masterpieces in the future, but for now, I need some stairs. So I carved up two sets, a long single flight to go in our large tower stairwells, and then two small single flights to go in the L-shaped stairwells in the lower city. Boy, did that take a while. I really don't want to do that again. Oh no. Oh, don't do it, Lockie. It's silicon time, baby! Now, long-time viewers of the channel will remember the absolute disaster that unfolded the last time I poured silicon for the Siege of Gondor project.
Video linked up above if you want to have a good chuckle at my misery, but this time I'm not making any of those mistakes and making nice small molds with good old Pinky Sill. I hot glued the stairs straight down to my table, made a nice secure mold box with foam core, mixed up my silicon, and smashed it in nice and fast. Although I almost forgot how the 6-minute pot life of Pinky Sill is more like 3 minutes in the Brisbane heat, but I got it in quick enough that we were all right, maybe just. I demolded the silicon from the molding box and pried out my mold masters without damaging them too much, which means I can reuse them in the build, and then slapped the molds out in the garage. I threw in some mold release and put in some polyurethane resin, and after 15 minutes she was cured and I demolded our first duplicates. A few bubbles here and there in the mold from me taking too long to get the silicon in, but nothing remotely worrying, especially for a ruined city. I just cleaned them up with snippers and then cast a whole bunch until I had 6 sets for the stairwells in the lower city. I glued them all around the place with liquid nails, as well as one of the stairs in the lower portions of the 3rd tower, and there we have a fully constructed riverbank level, and I am pumped with how it's turned out. Now, I know that we said we were going to build the back of the city today, but because I was about to pour all of the resin for the first 2 riverbank pieces, if you haven't seen that video, it's linked up above, I instead decided to fully finish this piece first, so I grabbed some rattle cans and primed the entire board. Black went down on the water, which I later built up to a graduated luminance profile of black to light grey, and then dark grey went down all over the ruins and stonework. I then brought that to life with a zenithal of light grey to grab all of those raised details. This was actually pretty tricky on this board with the insane amount of pieces hidden under gangways and archways and kind of tricky spots, but I got it all in the end. Now our paint scheme here actually varies from the normal OSGILIATH scheme that long-time viewers will have seen before because of just the staggering amount of detail in these pieces from GW Plastic. I just had to give everything a nice focused overbrush, which is basically a really aggressive dry brush with a lighter grey, sort of similar to the old Fortress Grey from GW. This lightened the pieces quite a lot and really accented all those sculpted details, but don't worry, that lightness will get knocked back very aggressively with our washes. I finished off our water texture with the airbrush blue-grey, just like the last 2 pieces, and then threw down our standard 3 washes. First up was an all-over acrylic black. This was pretty heavy, just to try and knock back that grey, really stain into all the recessed details, especially on the flat surfaces where this acrylic wash kind of pools and dries with lovely weathering tide marks. And then I came in with 2 oil washes, a brown mix of burnt umber and burnt sienna, which I worked into all the recesses of the structures, basically wherever grime is going to naturally accumulate around the base of the walls, all that sort of region. And then a straight lamp black wash, which I just stippled around all over the place and then feathered out onto the building to really build up that weathered stone aesthetic. Then it was time for our rubble layer. So a big old dumping of city rubble and grimdark base ready blended straight down into some fast drying basing glue, all from Geek Gaming. And once again, like the grout layer, this is another important layer as it gives us some extra protection against those resin leaks. Before I did the top levels of the building, I realized I'd actually forgotten something. All of the timber beams exposed by the ruined building. So I grabbed some Citadel Contrast Garagak Sewer, which is my favorite brown in the whole contrast range, and slowly and meticulously picked out every single beam, and it was just so worth it. It's such an awesome detail in these kits, and it really comes up great. Once that was down, a whole load more base ready on top. If you're looking for any of the Geek Gaming products, check out my store, Zorpazorp.com, link down below. And then once it was all dry, I sealed it with isopropyl alcohol and Geek Gaming matte scenic steel to lock it down tight. And there we have the very first section of the new board completely finished and ready to be covered in liters and liters of epoxy resin. A few weeks ago, we drowned my massive 40 square foot OSGILIATH board in liters and liters of resin, and we had to wait 24 hours before we knew if the largest Wargaming Scenery resin pour I've ever seen was a raging success or a colossal failure of leaking resin flooding my garage. I'll give you guys a hint, it certainly wasn't the first one, so it's finally time to reveal the mega river pour. Well, almost. First, I'm going to edge you guys just a little bit harder because last week we built a whole new section of the OSGILIATH layout, and it is more flooded than any city block so far, and it's going to take about as much resin as the first 2 boards combined. And this third and final flooded city gaming board threw a few challenges my way I didn't quite expect. I actually did this pour at the same time as the other 2. I just had it hidden behind a curtain like the sneaky bastard that I am, because the Games Workshop plastic kits weren't actually allowed to be shown yet. So So first I'm going to blast through the resin pour on this board, and then we can reveal all 100 pounds of resin together in one terrifying orgy of flooded epoxy. Just like the first two pours, I threw down our gate system of a billion layers and redundancies, starting with a layer of masking tape, construction adhesive along the tape joint, a sheet of foam core, and then 3 layers of hot glue. Then on the inside, I began our resin layer with a seam of 5-minute epoxy to seal up the outward join. Surely we are safe from leaks. Like, surely. Like, come on. I even seamed up the edges against the board elements. We've got to be good, right? After raising the height of the tape layer with a second strip of tape, I checked our board was level, and then we were ready to start smashing in the resin. Just like last time, we're using a massive 100 pounds of Megapore epoxy resin that was sent to me by Barnes here in Australia. A big shout out to the folks at Barnes. The links for the resin is down below, and I jumped into doing another edge test with a small quantity of resin, and with no leaks showing yet, I added a bit more to complete the very first super thin layer that covered the whole board and let that partially cure for about 12 hours. Still, with no signs of leaks under that low pressure of the first layer, it was time to just pour in the rest and hope for the best. Now, as I showed you guys in the last video, I mixed some different concentrations of blues and greys into the resin to try and help create a murkiness to the water, as well as help accentuate the paint work I'd done underneath to sell that effect of deepening water getting deeper as we moved into the river. But here on this board, we have our first real section of flooded shallows. I played with a few different styles, but quickly realized that in the shallow regions where you can see all the submerged tiling and rubble beneath the water, we want very little blue mixed in, but completely clear doesn't read well either. So I opted for some plain grey with the odd bit of blue, as well as blending the layers together and allowing some of the blue from the darker pours to naturally bleed into the shadows. With that shallow layer down, I kept adding on just more and more resin to the deepest part of the pour, which naturally displaced the mid regions into the shallows, creating a really nice uneven blend between the blue and the plain grey layers that added some great interest to the sunken level of the city. The one thing that I did not realize was just how sunken I'd actually made this lower level. If you guys will recall from the build video linked up above, if you haven't seen it, the whole point of this section was to capture the sunken streets aesthetic, and I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to sell that effect. But Barnes have sent me so much resin, over 100 pounds of the stuff, that I've ended up with this city sector way more sunken than I anticipated. But it looks amazing, so who cares? I gave it all a quick blast with my heat gun to pop any surface bubbles, and then it was time to pray to Iluvata and basically check on the damn thing once every 15 minutes for the next 24 hours.
24 hours has passed since the big pour, and everything is looking pretty good. We've got some nice bodies of water. It's actually kind of cured with a little micro texture. Obviously, we're still going to be building up a wave layer on the surface of this, but it's a promising start. We did, of course, have that one leak. We were fighting a bit of a losing battle. We did eventually stop, or at least slow the rate of leaking, but we did lose probably 4 or 5 mil. This is definitely shallower than when I poured it. You can see it would have been all the way up to there, and now that rock is exposed. So we have lost some resin. We've still got the wave surface layer to bring that back up a little if we need, and it still looks fine, but I am worried that this board is now resined to the table. So let's rip off all of our gates. Let's get these off. Let's have a look at how the side looks, and then we can see just how nice these boards look together.
So at first this was a total bitch. Peeling off the core board, it just totally disintegrated, and my fingers were soon throbbing as I was prying and peeling tiny bits off at a time. I tried my knife and cutting it out, but I wasn't really getting it off cleanly, and then I paused the camera to try and work out a better technique before continuing, and well, this happened.
So I'm pretty sure the camera was not rolling when that just happened. But that was certainly a good test of how strong the resin is. The board has not shattered. Now I just have to work out how to get my leg out from under the table. I'm gonna try and go this way. Alright, the first priority is saving the board, obviously. Oh, it's the resin tub. That's what stops the board from collapsing. Let's get these tubs out. I guess I'll finish this one on the ground. Larissa has just made a very good point. What if that had happened like 5 hours ago while the resin was liquid? Oh my god. Okay. Let's finish cleaning the gates. So I made pretty light of that situation, but now looking back at the footage, this is kind of utterly terrifying. Basically, I was trying a new method with my hammer and chisel to knock back the gate, but the vibrations of tapping the chisel unbalanced the very dodgy 35-year-old table tennis table legs, and one side collapsed onto my right leg. But luckily, the resin tubs underneath caught the bulk of the load, and my leg was simply pinned in place. The absolute true wonder, though, is that this table didn't collapse of its own accord while the resin was still wet. If this had come down during the night while I was asleep, I could have woken up to 30 pounds of resin cured to the floor of my mother-in-law's garage. Bullet dodged there for sure. On the plus side, the chisel method was not only a lot faster, but if you get the angle right, you can basically take off all of the layers of the gate in one smooth piece. The first gate is off, and I discovered a whole new problem. The branding on the masking tape has actually transferred to the surface of the resin, leaving blue and yellow pigment on the river's edge, but oddly enough, this wasn't actually that hard to fix. I just grabbed a really sharp blade and cut through it. The epoxy doesn't fully cure for 72 hours, which is also probably why the board didn't shatter when the table collapsed. So it's still got a little bit of give and it's not super brittle. So I could literally saw back and forth, slicing through the resin.
This is a swimming pool and my hands are people and this is a change room. Oh, we want to go for a swim. It's an ice station. It's not a swimming pool, it's an ice station.
The weight of the resin had like bowed the gates anyway, so it's gone over the lip of that table edge, so I needed to do that anyway to kind of get the edges to line up where they should be, and this also helped me get rid of the meniscus from the surface tension of the drying resin. Any dodgy cuts are just going to get hidden by the wave layer down the track. Then it's time for board number 2.
Oh, it's definitely stuck to the table.
Oh wow, it's not that much. The hot glue had actually done the job and slowed down the leak enough so that not that much resin had actually flowed underneath the board at all. I was really surprised. I chiseled off the leak defenses and then I set about cleaning up the gates, which came off much faster with the new method. The second board needed a fair bit of cleanup with the knife, but it all cut down reasonably well, although this part seriously burns the hands and forearms. It's such a workout. The third board was much the same, although a little bit trickier again because I had a lot of that tape kind of peeling inwards on this one, but I soon had all 3 resin pores degated and relatively cleaned up. Before we can throw all the boards together to see the flooded city in all its glory, we actually still have a whole city subsector to complete. Now this was Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before we were set to film our OSGILIATH Battle Report campaign, which will be either out already by now or about to come out when this video drops. I'll leave a link in the description and the pinned comment for you guys so you can watch that when they are live. But I needed to rapidly finish the last 2x4 foot panel at the back of the new Games Workshop plastic OSGILIATH mega build. First, we need to smash out some foundations for the central 2-tower structure of the massive L-shaped building. I cut down some extruded polystyrene to about 5mm thick and slashed it down to the floor plan, tacking pieces together with tape before going into full stonework mode for a nice easy texture all over. I then glued down the lower level of the structure, ensuring that the upper levels would sit and that it was all nice and square. Then to finish construction of the 3 towers, we need to put in our stairs. Last week we carved some stairs from foam and then made molds with silicon and cast a whole bunch more in polyurethane resin. I glued these mostly in with construction adhesive, chalking them in place from below and ensuring they'd lined up in the right spot with the floor above, but occasionally I dropped in a little drop here and there of 5-minute epoxy resin to help really keep them strong until that adhesive sort of fully cures over about 24 hours. I hacked away a few of the stairs as well with some clippers to create some really fun damaged stairwell patterns, especially where the walls or the floors nearby had collapsed, and I was really happy with the finished look once they were all in. I just can't wait to see them covered with rubble. Then I decided that I needed at least one more building for the city to give it enough life to kind of film the battle reports, and after falling so in love with the L-shaped form, I decided to repeat it, but on a smaller scale, but still just as tall. So I started smashing plastic together. For a different architectural vibe, I used a lot of the pieces that had the murder hole style windows, especially on the lower level, and then started building upwards, ensuring that my floor plans left room for yet more stairwells. We want as many ways up and down from these
these buildings as possible to enhance playability. In fact, this building gets a massive run in the first battle report. It's really cool. Just like our earlier buildings, I used all my tricks and techniques to make blasted out holes, gangways, collapse walls, and build the structure in modular segments that were fully removable for gameplay, storage, and filming purposes. With the main structure knocked up, I laid it out on the board and got my spacing for the primary upper gangway that would join this little L to the big L, and then ripped a hole in the side of the big L tower so that we had somewhere to join this unforeseen gangway, and knocked the piece together using the same locking methods as earlier ones in last week's video. But before I could join these pieces together, I realized there was a huge height discrepancy in the buildings. Those of you who've watched the build so far will remember that when I built these original towers, I used trim pieces, these little detail-y bits, in between every single wall layer, and thus I ran out of those pieces. And so when I'm building the 2 tile high walls for this building, they're actually quite shorter, and across 6 tiles, that really adds up to a significant drop in height over the course of the building. So I decided to make up a really fancy plinth foundation that started higher and then terraced back down to the ground. I started with the thickest sheet of extruded poly and carved in our standard brickwork pattern, and then built a really fun set of stairwells and a little courtyard terrace in the inside corner of the L shape to step down to the board, and I just love how much this has added to the building. I also added the 2 missing stairwells wrapping around the L for quick access to the upper level, and also found a solution to all the missing trim pieces that I couldn't hide on the flooring levels, which basically just had this huge seam of exposed unfinished plastic. A nice little strip of polystyrene carved with a brickwork pattern worked an absolute treat. Quick, easy, and a nice point of visual difference from all the other buildings so far. Oddly, this little guy might be one of my favorite buildings. Sometimes simple is best. I knocked up another little stairwell standalone section to create yet another gangway, enabling this building to join down to the lower city as well, and then it was time to get all of these buggers painted. Super simple painting process for these, which we covered in the video last week. We just primed dark grey, zenithal light grey, and then an all-over dry brush and a big black acrylic wash. Then I slapped together a really simple temporary floor for this part of the city by just painting the green structural foam with dappled grey house paint, and then assembled the city in place. I am loving the layout, and by this point it was 2 AM on Saturday morning, with our bat reps due to be filmed in just 6 hours, but I still needed a few finishing touches. It's funny, I really didn't notice just how much the oil weathering layer does for the whole board until you see the before and after right next to each other, so I squashed my desperate need for sleep deep down and threw down the brown and black oil washes. Absolutely worth it. The final step on the very morning of the battle report, just before the guys arrived, was to throw base ready rubble just everywhere, all over the board. I didn't even have time to glue it down, that'll all have to be done later on, but even scattered loosely, it just adds so much, and it absolutely saves that sort of painted foam foundation. While we've got our water layer gear set up, it's time to begin the real water work. We are finally putting down our wave layer on the OSGILIATH megaboard. Now, I applied the exact same technique as the creek here, but this layer has a few extra challenges. First of all, this is a massive body of water, not just a little eddying stream, so we need the ripples to look like wind passing over the wide span of the Anduin, and of course, we're also trying to obscure the depth of the water. In our previous episode of our OSGILIATH journey, we saw how I laid down a color gradient to begin establishing deepening water on our timber foundation, and then when we poured the resin, I used different concentrations of colored resins and pigments to make the river look deeper as we get further away from the shore without increasing the depth of the resin. The effect sort of worked, but because the resin is so clear, you can clearly see the painted baseboard. So hopefully this wave layer helps us out there. We also have shallow water with sunken details that we don't want to obscure too much. So the whole thing is a big old juggling act. Man, OSGILIATH looks straight up amazing. I don't have the space to set up the entire board at the moment, so we'll just content ourselves with this single piece till you guys get to see all of the big OSGILIATH board when we film the massive siege, but man, this water effect looked so much better than I expected. Then it was time to throw down some models and begin the great battle of our time. Stay tuned for the amazing battle reports we filmed on this just monster of a board. They were a blast to play, and I'm thrilled to say that for now, this board is finished. Except for the wave layer, the whole back street, and the last 20% of the plastic Games Workshop sent me. Okay, it's not finished.